Hey y'all, don't forget to hit those buttons over there while you're listening. 10 years after Ferguson, black students are still kicked out of school at higher rates. Before he was suspended, Zaire Bird was thriving. He acted in school plays, played on the football team, and trained with other athletes. He had never been suspended before. He had never even received attention. But when Bird got involved in a fight after school one day, none of that seemed to matter to administrators. Bird said he was defending himself and two friends after three other students threatened to rob them. Administrators at Tri Cities High School in Georgia called the altercation a group fight, an automatic 10-day suspension. After a disciplinary hearing, they sent him to an alternative school. The experience nearly derailed his education. The last 4 years were a lot for me, from online school to getting suspended, said Bird, who started high school remotely during the pandemic. I could have learned more, but between all that and changing schools, it was hard. In Georgia, black students like Bird make up slightly more than one-third of the population, but they account for the majority of students who receive punishments that remove them from the classroom, including suspension, expulsion, and being transferred to an alternative school. Those disparities in Georgia and across the country became the target of a energized reform movement a decade ago, spurred by the same racial reckoning that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. For many advocates, students and educators pursuing racial justice meant addressing disparate outcomes for Black youth that begin in the classroom, often through harsh discipline and underinvestment in low income schools. Absolutely. The past decade has seen some progress in lowering suspension rates for Black students, but massive disparities persist. Yes, yes, very much in my state and city, especially. In Missouri, for example, an AP analysis found Black students served 46% of all days in suspension in the 2013-2014 school year, the year Michael Brown was pew-pewed and unalived by police in that state, days after he completed high school. 9 years later, the percentage had dropped to 36%, according to the state data obtained via a public records request. Both numbers far exceed Black students' share of the student population, about 15%. And in California, the suspension rate for Black students fell from 13% in 2013 to 9% a decade later. That's still 3 times higher than the white suspension rate. The country's racial reckoning elevated the concept of the school to prison pipeline. The notion that being kicked out of school or dropping out increases the chance of arrest and imprisonment years later. School systems made incremental progress in reducing suspensions and expulsions, but advocates say the underlying bias and structures remain in place. The upshot: more Black kids are still getting kicked out of school. That obviously fuels the school to prison pipeline. Yes, yes, yes. Students who are suspended, expelled, or otherwise kicked out of the classroom are more likely to be suspended again. They become disconnected from their classmates and they're more likely to become disengaged from school. They also miss out on learning time and are likely to have worse academic outcomes, including in their grades and rates of graduation. Nevertheless, some schools and policymakers have doubled down on exclusionary discipline since the pandemic. In Missouri, students lost almost 780,000 days of class due to in school or out of school suspensions in 2023, the highest number in the past decade. In Louisiana, Black students are twice as likely to be suspended as white students and receive longer suspensions for the same infractions, according to a 2017 study from the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans. Yet a new law goes into effect this year that recommends expulsion for any middle or high school student who is suspended 3 times in one school year. Federal guidelines to address racial disparities in school discipline first came from President Barack Obama's administration in 2014. Federal officials urged schools not to suspend, expel, or refer students to law enforcement except as a last resort and encouraged restorative justice practices that did not push students out of the classroom. Those rules were rolled back by President Donald Trump's administration, but civil rights regulations at federal and state levels still mandate the collection of data on discipline. Thank goodness. In Minnesota, the share of expulsions and out of school suspensions going to Black students dropped from 40% in 2018 to 32% 4 years later. Still, nearly 3 times Black students' share of the overall population. The discipline gulf in that state was so egregious that in 2017, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights ordered dozens of districts and charter schools to submit to legal settlements over their discipline practices, especially for Black and Native American students. In these districts, the department found almost 80% of disciplinary consequences issued for subjective reasons like disruptive behavior were going to students of color. School buildings were closed for the pandemic during much of the settlement period, so it's hard to assess whether the schools have since made progress. Kalia Pringle, an education advocate in St. Paul, says her daughter experienced repeated suspensions. The harsh discipline put her on a bad track. For a time, Pringle said her daughter wanted to drop out of school. Pringle, then a history and civics teacher herself, quit her job to become an advocate, hoping to offer one on one support to families experiencing harsh school discipline. That's when I really began to see it wasn't just me. Every Black parent I worked with was calling me about suspensions. Education reform emerged quickly as a goal for the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2016, when the vision for Black Lives platform was finalized, it included a call for education system that acknowledged students' cultural identities, supported their mental and physical health, and did not subject them to unwarranted search, seizure, and arrest inside schools. We need to end mass incarceration and mass criminalization, and that begins in the school, said the policy leader with the Movement for Black Lives. Data shows that with each expulsion or suspension, students are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. In addition to being disciplined at higher rates, Black students receive more severe punishments than their white peers for similar or even the same behavior. Students of color are often not given the same benefit of the doubt that their white counterparts receive and might even be perceived as having harmful motives. Attention to these disparities has led to some changes. Many districts adopted restorative justice practices which aim to address the root cause of behavior and interpersonal conflicts rather than simply suspending students. Schools increased investment in mental health resources. Yes. And for a time, some districts, including Chicago and Minneapolis, worked toward removing police from schools. Those efforts gained new momentum in 2020 after the unaliving of George Floyd. But now we've got, right, schools wanting to take a harder line. They're wanting to have more police involvement. Ugh. All right, y'all get the gist of what we're working with. Don't forget to hit those buttons over there. I see no changes. I hope y'all stay doesn't suck. Okay, love y'all. Bye.